as our leadership in Latvia as a framework nation holding the Eastern Front of NATO is demonstrating, Canada has always done more than its share in NATO, and we will continue to.
Justin Trudeau defending how much this country spends on its military. He was responding to comments by U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson at a NATO meeting in Brussels this week. Tillerson told members they need to spend 2% of their GDP on defense or come up with a plan to do so by May. But Trudeau didn't sound ready to budge on the 1% we currently put towards defense. He says we do the heavy lifting in other ways. So, are we pulling our weight, or do the Americans have a point here? Let's bring in our Sunday Scrum. John Ibbotson, let me start with you. Do they have a point?
They have a point, and we have a point. I wish I could be, more strident than that, but it's true. Canada spends less on defense as a portion of its total GDP than almost any country in NATO. It's why we are chronically unable to build ships that we promised to build. It's why we are chronically unable to buy jets that we're supposed to be buying. Procurement is a mess. We have a very fine armed forces. It is very well trained, not so well equipped, and certainly not so well financed. But, and so the Americans do have a point. Even Barack Obama, remember, when he was up here in Ottawa, was saying, NATO needs more Canada, is what he meant was NATO needs Canada to spend more on its military.
Right.
On the other hand, in Kandahar, we were there. In Libya, we were there. In Latvia now, we are there. Canada's response is a reasonable one. Whenever the pointy end of the stick comes into play, Canada is making its contribution. So as long as we're there on the front lines when we're needed, who cares what we spend?
Denise?
Right, and I think that's key here, and probably what I would be more interested in hearing from the Canadian government is how you quantify what the Canadian contribution is. So, okay, let's set aside the 2%, which would bring us up to close to $40 billion, which, quite frankly, given the current finances of the country, we simply don't have to pull together in the next 7 years by 2024, as the NATO group has suggested. Now, what does it mean when they talk about we contribute in other ways? I'm interested in what that defense policy review that comes out later this year in May will identify specific metrics that, yes, there's money that we contribute towards defense, but what does it mean when we are training, when we're leading missions, we're offering logistical support? That, I think, is really important. That can help Canada make the case to say it may not be the 1% the 2% as NATO understands this, but here's the math as to why we would end up actually not only being close to the 2%, but perhaps even surpassing that.
Susan, let me throw this into the mix, and then I'll come to you. Don't we kind of have the U.S. over a barrel here in this case? We share the airspace. They have to protect us. There's really nothing for them to threaten us with because their defense is our defense, and our defense is their defense.
I guess so. Protect against whom is my question. I guess North Korea. I think that this argument, which is an old one, it's actually a chronic complaint from Washington,
yep.
Is coming
and
in
NATO, by the way.
And NATO, by the way, is coming at a time when, the nature of war is changing and the enemy is changing and the whole way of conducting war and equipping people for war is changing. I think that in this case, I support what Trudeau's doing. I think he isn't buckling to long-standing American demands. He's trying to find out where Canadians can be effective. So he's not abandoning our commitment to the rest of the world, but trying to find out where Canadians can be effective. And probably he has the support of most people on his position. May I also say that although this is a chronic and long-standing complaint from the States, it is incredibly amplified, as so many other things are, by Donald Trump, who, if anybody remembers, I think The Guardian reported that when Angela Merkel was there a couple of weeks ago, Trump presented her with a bill for $300 billion and said, like, Germany's been freeloading off of us for all these years. That is not diplomatic. It's not true.
And it's not how it works.
It's not serious, actually.
Yeah, and it's not how it works. I mean, you're supposed to spend your own money.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay. So, John, what's Denise, you were about to say something?
Yeah, and I was really just going to pick up on that point that these are conversations that have been happening for decades in terms of, you know, who's pulling their weight in NATO and who's not. But the bottom line is the alliance remains strong in terms of, and again, we saw that from sort of a backpedaling from the Trump administration, suggesting that, you know, if there was a need to support their NATO allies, that they would be there front and center. But from the Canadian perspective, I would also say that this is really not Trudeau's mandate in terms of raising defense money by, you know, another $20 billion. He had another mandate around the deficit, which I suppose is interesting in and of itself. But what that signals to me in looking at the Trump administration is how much weight can they actually carry around this conversation when you look at the domestic policy mess that they're currently in. So that's something that I'll be watching very closely. Okay,
Paige Christensen writes, surely NATO spending would depend on the current threat levels, not a fixed amount every year.
Well, and can I just, yeah. I'm sorry to interrupt in the mid-Twitter, but Paige makes a very, very good point there. The threat level is actually quite high. This goes back to what Susan was saying, that, you know, the nature of those who say, like Susan, that the nature of war is changing and that it's about counterterrorism and that it's about non-state actors. Some of that is true. But on the other hand, there are very old-fashioned strategic threats to the Western Alliance. There's China and its aggression in the South China Sea. There's Russia and its push against the eastern borders of Europe. There's a reason why we've gone into Latvia. We've gone into Latvia to tell the Russians, do not invade Latvia or the Baltic states, or there will be consequences. So it's still a very old-fashioned 19th century world out there in many parts of the globe. And yes, NATO has to be ready to respond in the event it's needed.
Yeah, and, you know, Curtis, just one more point, Denise, Curtis, backing you up. Unlike the USA, Canada actually should spend money on its health care, education, or actually spends money on its health care, education, and infrastructure, speaking to the idea of whether this was a priority for Canadians in the last election. We have to leave it there on that topic, but there's lots more ahead on the Sunday Scrum. If any Conservative leadership candidates are having second thoughts, well, it's too late. The deadline to drop out of the race was Friday at midnight. All 14 hopefuls are sticking with it. So, just 7 weeks left. Where do things stand? Who are the top contenders? Our Sunday Scrum tackles that question next.